welcome to Wrestlers, and this is the second in our series. I'll be talking about what is reductionism, is the topic today. And again, as I said earlier, David and I are coordinated, but we are not collaborating on it. And so I'm a little, I'll be interested in seeing what David has to say, and he'll be interested in surprised, maybe upset at what I have to say. I don't know. We'll see how it goes.
Looks like I'll get last word.
I will get the last word, but next week I'll get the last word. So let's read a passage and get started here. The passage I suggest for today is from Psalm 139, familiar psalm, from verses 13 to the end. It says this: "For it was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. That I know very well. Wonderful are your works. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes beheld my unformed substance. In your book was written all the days that were formed for me, when none of them as yet existed. How weighty to me are your thoughts, O God! How vast is the sum of them! I try to count them. They are more than the sand. I come to the end. I'm still with you. Oh, that you would kill the wicked, O God, and that the bloodthirsty would depart from me. Those who speak of you maliciously and lift themselves up against you for evil. Do I not hate those who hate you, O God? And do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with perfect hatred. I count them my enemies. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my thoughts. See if there is any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." Word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
We might just end up today and just walk away. That's a pretty good sermon on that. Let's pray. And Lord, we do thank you for bringing us together for this fellowship, for this opportunity to grow and to understand your word better, and to learn how to apply your word to our world today in 2016, and which we're challenged by many things that we read in the newspaper and things that are going on around us. But today, right now, I pray that you guide us into focus on you, and with a focus on Jesus Christ. And we pray in his name. Amen. So, thinking about the topics, one question I often ask people is, who is the real enemy of Christianity? Who's the enemy? Let me give you some suggestions. Desire, pride, moral imperfections, right? Sin, concupiscence, hypocrisy, false teachers, the principalities and powers, the world, the flesh, the devil, philosophical autonomy, humanism, secularism, Enlightenment rationalism, evolutionism, scientism, naturalism, mechanism, reductionism, modernity, technology, postmodernism, syncretism, pluralism, paganism, atheism, pantheism, idolatry. Okay? Get the idea? A lot of suggestions. Which one would you pick? Actually, one time I did a Bible study on that, and I concluded from Hebrews chapter 2 and 3, there's 5 things that are the enemy, and they are temptation, sin, Satan, suffering, and death. So that's the biblical answer. Who is our enemy? Right? None of these isms really is an ultimate enemy. And so today I want to talk about reductionism, which is often identified as one of these enemies. And I want to try to take, I hope, take a little bit of the force and the threat of reductionism away from us and realize really what is involved. And I think David is going to do some more, gives us more details along that line. But the literature in the 20th century, and we've mostly been focused on the 20th century scientists in these things, the literature does set us up for identifying reductionism as an enemy. And I want to start with and I'm going to just do some readings from some books that talk about this. And we could start with Isaac Newton, as we did last Sunday, thinking about Newton and his laws of physics, which made a tremendous step up. I wanted to say quantum leap, but besides, a quantum leap is a very small leap. But to understanding the world in physical terms. And it caught on so fast and so enthusiastically that over the century or two after Newton, a lot of other people started coming in with laws that were kind of like formulas and mathematical formulas for laws of psychology, laws of human society, laws of economics, like Karl Marx, and all these theories that were kind of tapping into this kind of mathematical approach that Newton took in his physics. And of course, a lot of those were completely inappropriate approaches to these fields, trying to scientize these fields. So a well-known historian of science, Alexander Corre, summarized this whole episode briefly. I will read this because I think this is pretty profound in one of his books, Newtonian Studies. Yet there is something for which Newton, or better to say not Newton alone, but modern science in general, that can still be made responsible. It is the splitting of our world in two. I've been saying that modern science broke down the barriers that separated the heavens and the earth, and that it united and unified the universe. And that is true. But as I've said too, it did this by substituting for our world of quality and sense perception, the world in which we live and love and die, another world, a world of quantity, of reified geometry, a world in which, though there is a place for everything, there is no place for man. Thus, the world of science, the real world, became estranged and utterly divorced from the world of life, which science has been unable to explain, not even to explain it away by calling it subjective. True, these worlds are every day, and even more and more, connected by the praxis. Yet for the theory, they are divided by an abyss. An abyss. Two worlds. This means two truths, or no truth at all. Thus, this is the tragedy of modern mind, which solved the riddle of the universe, but only to replace it by another riddle, the riddle of itself. That's Corre. So we're left in this kind of dualism, living in two worlds today. So that gets us into the theme of reductionism. There's several other authors that came into this. Here's Newton, his mathematical approach to the world, to nature, and to physics. As this, of course, went on, we go into biology, starting to apply this, and ultimately we got to things like eugenics. Francis Galton, who was the cousin of Darwin, and back in the late 19th century, promoting ideas of eugenics, this new field in which all these different branches of science would come together and develop self-directed human evolution, where we are. And of course, we know where that ended up in World War II. Ernst Haeckel, German scientist who started looking at embryology and discovering the similarities in different animals and humans in his book. And that was 1899. So you can see just about the beginning of the 20th century a lot of this reductionist movement started to come along. Of course, we know about people like Bertrand Russell. He has a famous quote. I'll read it here from Bertie Russell. That man is the product of causes which had no provision of the end they were achieving, that his origin, his growth, his hopes, and his beliefs are but the outcome of accidental co-locations of atoms, that no fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve an individual life beyond the grave, that all the labors of all the ages, all the devotion, the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system, and that the whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. All these things, if not quite beyond dispute, are yet so nearly certain that no philosophy which rejects them can hope to stand.
That's inspiring.
Sounds like it's from Ecclesiastes.
That's Bertrand Russell, The Free Man's Worship, 1903. Okay. So, kicking off the 20th century. B.F. Skinner, psychology. There he is with his pigeon boxes doing experiments on operant conditioning. And he summed up his philosophy after his work with this in a book called Beyond Freedom and Dignity. The self is a repertoire of behaviors appropriate to a given set of contingencies. The picture which emerges from a scientific analysis is not of a body with a person inside, but of a body which is a person in the sense that it displays a complex repertoire of behavior. The picture is, of course, unfamiliar. The man thus portrays a stranger, and from the traditional point of view, he may not seem to be a man at all. For at least 100 years, said Joseph Wood Crutch, we have been prejudiced in every theory, including economic determinism, that reduces the stature of man until he ceases to be a man at all, in any sense that the humanists of an earlier generation would recognize. What is now under attack, said Maslow, is the being of man. C.S. Lewis put it quite bluntly. Man is being abolished. What is being abolished is autonomous man, the inner man, the homunculus, the possessing demon, the man defended by the literatures of freedom and dignity. His abolition has long been overdue. Autonomous man is a device used to explain what we cannot explain in any other way. He has been constructed from our ignorance. As our understanding increases, the very stuff of which he composed vanishes. Science does not dehumanize man, it dehomunculizes him, and it must do so if it is to prevent the abolition of the human species. To man, qua man, we readily say, good riddance. I'll just stop there.
And look what abolition is like.
All right, now we all know about Richard Dawkins. I don't even think I have to quote much of that, but I'll just say this. The argument of this book is that we and all other animals are machines created by our genes. Like successful Chicago gangsters, our genes have survived, in some cases for millions of years, in a highly competitive world. This entitles us to expect certain qualities in our genes. I shall argue that a predominant quality to be expected in a successful gene is ruthless selfishness. So that's Dawkins, right? And this book, Selfish Gene, 1966.
Social Darwinism.
It's not Darwinism, it's reductionism, what I'm talking about today. Now here's another example, a very recent example from a physicist I met at the University of Maryland. He's a brilliant mathematician who has done a lot of the work on figuring out the elementary parameters of the universe based on the data from the Big Bang measurements by the satellites that NASA is putting up. Max Tegmark says, the assumption that there exists an external physical reality completely independent of us humans is accepted by most, but not all, physicists. With a sufficiently broad definition of mathematics, the external reality hypothesis implies the mathematical universe hypothesis that our physical world is a mathematical structure. A mathematical structure is an abstract set of entities with relations between them. The entities have no baggage. They have no properties whatsoever except those relations. This means that our physical world not only is described by mathematics, but that it is mathematical, a mathematical structure, making us self-aware parts of a giant mathematical object. So, here's, I'll wrap it up with Steven Weinberg, who was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist that unified the electromagnetic and weak interactions in particle physics, and he summed it up this way. However all these problems may be resolved, and whichever cosmological model proves correct, there is not much comfort in all of this. It is almost irresistible for humans to believe that we have some special relation to the universe, that human life is not just a more or less farcical outcome of a chain of accidents reaching back to the first 3 minutes, but that we somehow were built in from the beginning. As I fly over in an airplane over 30,000 feet, flying over Wyoming en route home from San Francisco, below the earth looks very soft and comfortable, fluffy clouds here and there, the snow turning pink as the sunset, roads stretching straight across the country from one town to another. It's very hard to realize that all of this is just a tiny part of an overwhelmingly hostile universe. It is even harder to realize that this present universe has evolved from an unspeakably unfamiliar early condition and faces a future extinction of endless cold or intolerable heat. The more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless. So that's Steven Weinberg. So here on the slide, we're talking about, we are all reductionists now. Is it really true there are new kinds of laws that govern complex systems? We would not pay much attention to a proposed law of macroeconomics that could not possibly be explained in terms of the behavior of individuals, or a hypothesis about superconductivity that could not possibly be explained in terms of the properties of electrons and nuclei. The reductionist attitude provides a useful filter that saves scientists in all fields from wasting their time on ideas that are not worth pursuing. So in that sense, we're all reductionists now. Okay. Now, I'm going to end it up with a little discussion about Jacques Monod. And this is where it takes a turn. And I think I'm just going to have to quote him because Jacques Monod was a Nobel Prize-winning biologist, and he discovered a new kind of process going on in cells, and this is one of the enzymes that he particularly focused on. It's called beta-galactosidase, which is irrelevant, but to my point here. But the point was that he discovered what we call the second secret of life. Of course, the first secret of life was DNA, but the second most important discovery about biology so far is this idea of what Jacques Monod called gratuity, or the operon model. And it's kind of complicated, and David and I might try to wrestle it to the ground and get a little clarified. But the work that he did, I'm going to skip over all this and basically try to get to this final conclusion that Monod made. The idea is that the DNA sequence is decoupled from the chemistry. It is information that matters. It's the information that the DNA is using. It's as if these molecules are reading this DNA like information, telling them what to construct and what to control. Not just building proteins, but controlling which proteins get built, where, when, how. All the control stuff is in the DNA. And so that's like it transcends the laws of chemistry. It's not just chemistry. It's going to another level of reality. That's what he's trying to emphasize here. So Monod, now of course Jacques Monod is a fascinating man, and his book Chance and Necessity kind of sums up the title of this. The interplay of chance and necessity. That's what we talked about a little bit last week with the work of Bill Phillips, where he talked about the fine-tuning, the universe a put-up job and everything is precisely tuned to make things happen. On the other hand, chance or randomness is a necessary component of quantum mechanics. We would not exist without that quantum mechanics. So the interplay of these comes together. Jacques Monod, French, very liberalist, communist, atheist, but his science is his legacy, and it leaves us with something quite interesting to think about. And that's my attempt to respond to these accusations of reductionism. So I can sum it up basically this way. It does no good for a preacher or a theologian to say reductionism is false, it's not valid. That's, special pleading, that's dogmatism. That isn't going to really work and be convincing. We need to figure out how we can use science to defend science and to defend the faith. And I think that it can be done, and that's what I discovered in looking at this work of Monod. Francis Crick, who of course was one of the discoverers of DNA, Watson and Crick, back in the 50s, he said of all Monod's ideas, this allostery, which he called it, was the one that Crick most admired. Jack Monod's work on allostery is a very powerful theoretical concept. Never mind the mechanism of it that had to be worked out. It meant you could connect any circuit with any other metabolic circuit because there was no necessary relation between what was going on at the catalytic side and the control molecule. That's an extremely powerful idea. And here's my attempt to explain it. Think of a letter. You write a letter, you put it in an envelope, put an address on the envelope, and send it away. Right? Suppose somebody else takes that envelope, doesn't open it, and puts it in another envelope, puts another address on it, and sends it to somebody else. And then somebody else takes that envelope and puts it in a bigger envelope, puts another address on it, and sends it someplace else, right? So that is basically the concept of behind the Internet protocol. Packet switching. You cut the signal up into packets, put them in envelopes, put a little address around it, an IP address or something, and then you send that off to a server and it sends it where it needs to go, through the switch. So actually there's 7 layers of these kind of envelopes in the Internet. And so you start at the top with the data that the user wants to send, and then it goes into a presentation layer, it goes down and gets an envelope wrapped around it every time until it finally gets to the physical link, like a radio signal, that goes over to another computer. It goes back up, taking out the envelopes one at a time, getting the addresses, putting them in the right place, and then finally, the computer, of course, is like the mailroom that sorts them all out, puts them in the right order. And so at the end of the thing, there we go, and we watch the rock band on the video. Okay, so that's, in a nutshell, very crudely, how the Internet works. Okay? So what I'm interested in here is the idea of this thing never could have been constructed if we had to build it all in one big chunk of software, right? It's all computer programs, it's all written in bits, right? But it's so complex, nobody ever could have built it in one level. It had to be divided up into layers that have different rules, different language, and each of them is irrelevant to the other. It's like these envelopes. I don't care what the address is. I'm not going to go inside and read the letter. I just want the address. That's all I need. The other stuff, the packet, I don't care what's in there. It doesn't matter. So the idea of don't care is a decoupling of the information, right? Now, these reductionisms are where you think of this illustration of the 5 blind men and the elephant, and they all look around and feel the elephant in different places. Some of them think it's like a hose. Some of them think it's like a tree trunk. Some of them think it's like a rope. Depending on where they approach, and I'm going to just move it into the physics realm, different aspects of reality, and people start looking at it and they say, this is all of reality. Everything is behavior. Everything is particles. Everything is mathematics. You see the idea? The reductionisms are attempts to claim all the territory, but there really isn't all the territory. It's only a small aspect of reality. And they're trying to emphasize that this one aspect of reality is all of reality. So that's what happens with reductionism.
Paul,
Yeah.
C.P. Snow, The Two Cultures and the Scientific Revolution, about 1950.
Right.
I think that is applicable.
Exactly.
You could probably better elucidate that than I can. I'd be interested in your reaction.
Well, C.P. Snow identified two cultures, a scientific culture and a humanist culture. And rarely did they talk to one another, even in the same university. And so they didn't know each other's facts. And C.P. Snow was one of the rare people that built a bridge between those two fields. And he would go into a literature meeting and be astonished that people didn't know, circumference of a circle or some basic facts of science. So you could flip it around the other way and say, I don't know a clue about literature, So that's the idea. So the same thing happens with human nature. It's a part of reality. So I've discovered some philosophers like Roy Bhaskar, critical realism, that have brought this idea of layers into philosophy. And I'll skip that part and just basically say here's two levels, A and B. He's saying level A is rooted in and emerges from level B, but it does not follow that level A is therefore nothing but level B. Back in the 60s, Donald Mackay, an early Christian British scientist, wrote a book called The Clockwork Image, in which he talked about the idea that lots of scientists say, man is nothing but something. As he called it, nothing buttery. Reductionism is nothing buttery. This habit of trying to reduce things to nothing but particles or behaviors or something like that.
Well, this happens in the ancient world with the Greeks.
Exactly.
And
This whole thing started
All
with
this guys, all I can hear is bar.
It goes all the way back to Thales, who's considered to be the first philosopher. He said everything is made of water. Everything reduces to water. And then the next philosopher came along and said, no, everything reduces to earth. No, everything reduces to fire. No, everything reduces to air. So they argued about the elements, What are the fundamental elements?
And here's
This is an old habit.
When you're a barbarian, I reject you. That's the theological depth of making that kind of decision. I reject everything about you because you're a barbarian.
Now, Alistair McGrath has picked up on Bhaskar's arguments here in some of his books, The Science of God. Excellent book of modern theology. And McGrath is really a prolific writer and also a high-quality writer. I very much admire McGrath. He's at Oxford, and he wrote another interesting short book that I think I recommend to everybody. It's called Surprised by Meaning, where he deals with some of these issues. And he says, the stratified approach to reality allows the multi-leveled embeddedness of revelation in reality to be fully and thoroughly explored, and its impact on the maintenance of the Christian tradition to be identified. So he's suggesting that we can start to think about layers of reality, levels of reality. Jacques Monod identified it in biology. We see them in physics. We see them in human nature, in networks, in philosophy, in theology. We see that there are levels of reality, and they don't preempt the others. There's a kind of a plurality of ways or perspectives of the world, and we can't imperialize and take over the roles of others. The idea of the unity of science was another thing that started in the 20th century, and it failed. We were not able to come up with a way to unify science. And so anyway, that's the situation.
Is that like unified field theory? Unified field theory?
But it's only unified particle physics, but is that all of reality? Of course we're all built of particles. And there are four fundamental forces, or three if you want. Electroweak, gravity, and strong force. Okay? Period. End of lecture. David, why don't you take over now if you want to carry on.
making a change, we have 10 handouts of this talk. So the most eager people are the ones that are going to get a copy. So, okay.
From last time.
Cool.
I gotta have one to match this time.
A symmetrical one, like you get the whole series, you get it right.
Turn the projector a little bit.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bruce.
Okay. Thank you all for coming. Paul told me that he was going to talk, mentioned he was going to talk a little bit about Jacques and about the internet. And so, fine. I had prepared something a little different, but since Paul was just talking about those, I do happen to have a couple charts that relate to that. Okay. And so I figure I'll start with that and then go on to whatever else I got. Okay. So, okay. So Monod discovered the lack of operon, okay, which is a gene that tells another gene what to do if you turn it on. So there's a suggestion there of hierarchy. Those of you who helped me out and saw my talk on genetics in January, or this time last year here at Wrestlers, some of these charts will look familiar to you. Okay, so what I wanted to convey is that contra Dawkins, there's no selfish gene that's in charge that's calling the shots. And in the next two charts, I'm going to tell you why that is. Okay. But I am also going to talk about the connections among them and also the connections on different layers. I agree there's different layers, however, the layers are interconnected. Now, this brings up the point that if the people who put together the Internet protocol had been hired by Mother Nature would have did it a different way. Okay. So the Internet protocol has in the different layers, as Paul well knows, something called encapsulation. So it's basically designed to keep one layer from another. So if you were sending laughing out loud cat videos, the physical layer does not know nor care what that is. It's encapsulated. I'm saying that in hierarchical, including adaptive structures, there are layers. However, the layers are connected in different ways. Okay, and I'm going to talk about that. Okay, so here we go. Self-rule. DNA has the blueprint, and it's more like a self-executing recipe. And I'm going to talk about that. So the way a normal engineer would do it would be to treat it as a system and put something in charge. Mother Nature doesn't quite do it that way. So that, for instance, here's an example of a mouse gene regulatory network. Now, the lactose operon is in a metabolic network. However, my contention is that the two networks are roughly analogous and that the same type of processes apply to both. So here I just want to point out that different nodes in the network will receive chemical information from other nodes and in turn use that to then transmit other chemicals which are picked up by other nodes, which make them do something. Okay? So the way it's been, this was called, an analogous chart to this was called, I think, the horror chart by a microbiologist who looked at it and like, oh my goodness, we wouldn't have drawn it up that way. We wouldn't have designed it that way. And so they compared it to a board meeting and a discussion among the different nodes about what's going on and what they should do. So that In the case of gene regulatory network, it's these genes that are getting together, these regulatory factors that are getting together and deciding which genes should be expressed. As we know, in each cell, it has a complete copy of DNA. So all genes are in all cells, but only some of them get expressed. So I think this also militates against the selfish gene argument, in that it's the network that's calling the shots and saying which gene should be expressed. Okay? So board meeting as opposed to selfish gene. Then as to whether they're interconnected, so I'm sure you'll all take this in. This is an E. coli gene network. E. coli is pretty simple. Okay? But this is its gene network, you can't see, which has the red dots for the nodes and then the black edges. In that, it's studied, and they have global transcription factors, which are like general managers giving wide scope directives. Other regulators are cross-functional teams. We're using a business analogy here. So I'm talking about there are different levels, okay, but they're interconnected. Cross-functional teams, modular genes are like departments, intermodular genes are like task forces. What we see is that at the lower level, a gene might be responding to one set of instructions. At a higher level, there are genes responding to a number of instructions. And at a yet higher level, the gene or regulators are responding to groups of instructions. Okay. So is this the way the internet people would have put it together? No. No. So it's complicated. There are layers, but the layers are interconnected and interweaving. And I want to talk about that in my actual prepared remarks. Okay. So then, are they connected? This is a fellow who talks about developmental biology, and he's saying at, I think, 17 days old, some nematode or a worm or something, this is his model of a gene regulatory network to help the poor little nematode get endophoresis or something, but to make a particular protein. Okay? And the guy drew it up as though it were an electronic circuit. Okay? That's what he got. So it works like an electronic circuit, and we can find that in a number of regulatory networks. They've been modeled as, and Paul will understand this, artificial neural networks that are recurrent with a hidden middle layer. Okay, so works like that, according to the latest science that I'm aware of. And you all took that in, right? Oh, yeah. Okay.
I think Paul should read the scripture here. We are fearfully and wonderfully made.
Fearfully, yes. Fearfully and wonderfully made. Right. Okay. And that just happened, right? Just worked that way out. You know, it's like, what do you want to do, Charlie? Well, let's bring that gene. Okay. So anyway, back to the future. So I just use this chart because it's talking about complex adaptive systems. That's where I'm going to go pretty soon. So I wanted to start with definition of reductionism. And there's two basic types. Methodological reductionism, which is breaking down a problem to its lowest constituent parts. It's been a standard scientific practice for centuries. It could be exemplified by talking about more and more knowing about less and less. Then there's a second kind, which is ontological reductionism. Ontology has to do with being. And I think that was what Paul very ably was smashing a few minutes ago. Okay. And that basically is saying that all there is those little small pieces that are out there. So that then militates against God, philosophy, All those would be superficial constructs that just have the appearance of having importance, whereas basically they're just driven by the little piece parts. For instance, you think you exist. And that you're an integrated person. Well, an ontological reductionist would say that you just have all these synapses firing in your brain, and it gives you the illusion, A, that you exist, B, that you have some kind of will. And instead, you're just following your biochemical signals that you get that are delivered to the brain and that in turn are passed on. So, we don't like that. And I think Paul did an excellent job of discussing why that's a bad thing. Okay. What I do want to talk about is the fact that, so methodological reductionism, even though it's been very useful for a long time, there are certain things it doesn't do. And I would say that those include dealing with complex adaptive systems which have emergent properties that cannot be predicted by the summation of the parts. Okay? So here's where I'm taking on Nobel Prize physicist Letterman, the gentleman that talked about the fact that this isn't a very good area of study. So I'm the one that, like him I'm taking on this one, and I'll tell you why. Okay. But he's also the one that says, you think you have an identity, but you don't. And that the more you understand about the universe, the more you think it's pointless. Okay? So I'm going up against Dr. Sunshine here. So science usually works according to methodological reductionism, the study of the parts. You can think of specialization by doctors. Many doctors now, they're general practitioners or whatever, but then they immediately send you to an eye, ear, nose, and throat guy. And if you get the eye, ear, nose, and throat guy, he's going to send you to the, subspecialist doctor who's really going to be able to help you. So specialization is a key part of science, and it's worked like a charm for a long time. It's helped bring us the physical prosperity that we have. No question. However, some scientists are examining what's called emergent behavior of systems. Turns out systems have properties. Why? Don't know. But systems have properties. And so this will again start to relate to a couple of the points that Paul brought up. And properties of the system may emerge that could not have been predicted by examining the piece parts. I'm going to give you some examples. So it may necessitate a change from bottom up to so-called holistic analysis. How does this work? And okay, so what are emergences? So this author has talked about a number of qualities that have emerged over time, which basically have brought us to where we are. So that if you were looking at our universe as a potential creator, and you did the piece parts, there would be this series of significant surprises, unless you could look forward in time, about why do these things work, and do they work because of what I'll call a hidden physical principle, or is it just one of those things? But the fact that it goes across so many domains makes me think there's an underlying principle there that we're going to talk about. Okay, so examples would be the primordium, the Big Bang. Okay, I don't know about you, but when I see things blow up, I think I'm going to have a lot of ash and trash and destruction. I don't think that it's going to lead to a huge multi-billion year creation of something. Right? So that's an example of something that you wouldn't expect from what the piece parts that you see. Right? Then there could be the elements, cells with organelles. Okay, so those are cells with piece parts in them, a layered system that interacts. So once you got that, then suddenly you have fungi, you've got plants, you've got animals. Just because the cell was able then to develop further once it had incorporated small sources of energy into it. So an omnipotent creator, for instance, could look at that and say, yeah, it's happening. But if you were around looking at that little eukaryote and you say, "Ah, I can see Times Square coming out of this," that would be special. That would be special. Okay, neurons. As in the upper right, you see an example of neurons. They're arranged in the brain. They interact with each other. Okay? So I can see neurons developing and being connected and firing one neuron to another neuron. How does that create mind? Is your brain your mind? How does it create consciousness? How's that working out for you? You want to create a machine with consciousness? Is it just a function of the fact of so many interconnections, suddenly you get consciousness out of it? Could be. I'm just giving this as an example of another area where the sum is more than the summation of its parts. Agriculture and urbanization brings a lot of civilization. There were hunter-gatherers, but then they decided to sit there and do plants and things. Suddenly you've got civilizational hierarchies. You've got a priest class, you've got a ruler class, you've got a soldier class. Eventually you get art and philosophy out of it. Well, who knew, on agriculture? Philosophy. I want to just bring that up because I believe that philosophy may have absolutely zero evolutionary advantage. Are there selection pressures for philosophy? Could be. If there were selection pressures for philosophy, I would say that Weinberg, excuse me for blowing his name the last time, having the philosophy that everything is meaningless is not good for your long-term survival, individually and as a society. Okay? I think if you think that the most important thing, sorry to pick on it, but is following the Kardashians, I don't think that that's adaptive over time. Okay, so we've talked about emergent. So what I want to shift now to is something called complex adaptive systems that are often associated with emergent behavior. And getting back towards Paul, what I'll be talking about here is the fact that from little piece parts, something qualitatively different can come out of them. Okay, so I think Paul and I are kind of talking about some of the same things here, and I want to talk about some of the methods by which, in the scientific looking at things, that brings out how can these other qualities emerge. So complex adaptive systems range over a number of domains. We can think of them in terms of the economy, or the stock market, or genetic regulatory networks, or the brain. And I'm going to have some examples here in a couple minutes. But let's just take a time out for a moment and talk about the economy. Huge interacting thing. Planned economies don't really work very well, as we've seen from socialism in the 20th century. Who's in charge of the American economy?
The president, of course.
The president. The president gets praised and blamed for the economy, and after the latest unemployment figures, the president got out and basically took credit for low unemployment. But if you ask him, how exactly did that work? So the president and Congress can do things like have a stimulus package, they can have policies in place, they can have a tax package to manage the economy, and yet, you can't control it, right? So, Bruce, who else might be thought of as being able to control the economy?
Federal Reserve.
Federal Reserve. Okay, so what can they do? Let me just say they're kind of a little bit like a one-trick pony. They can raise or lower interest rates and control the money supply. That's great, and it's very important, and we should do a good job at that. Does that control the economy? No. And every time you do something in the economy to try to fix it, somebody else takes advantage of it, and it changes. So this is my idea of a complex adaptive system. All right. So large number of parts. So if we try to go down to like a definition, and if people are into what I'm talking about, like kind of thing, so there's a book called Complexity, A Guided Tour by Melanie Mitchell. Very good. Wanted to recommend it. Interactions of different parts, so that you have a bunch of parts together and different kinds of parts, they start to interact. And it is their interaction that then produces this emergent behavior. Systems self-organizes collectively. No selfish gene in charge. Despite the Fed's prowess, not really in charge. Can be influenced bottom down, top up, emergent behavior. There are feedback loops. So that you'll find, like in the metabolic pathways, if the metabolic pathway is making something, it will also have a feedback loop in it that will monitor the environment. And when the environment shows that it has a lot of whatever that gene network is making, it turns off the mechanism. It's a feedback loop for adaptation. Okay? System cannot be adequately described mathematically. So there's other systems that could be described with partial differential equations, and they have linear responses. However, with complex adaptive systems, many of their reactions are nonlinear. So that if we think of the stock market, it goes up, but then sometimes it crashes. And then experts lose a lot of money. And wealth managers find out they were holding an awful lot of mortgage-backed securities. And so even the experts are looking at it, cannot predict this nonlinear behavior that happens in it. And these systems are more subject to what would be called fat tail responses. Okay, so if we think of a bell curve, so these are the tails. So a fat tail would be a very unusual or black swan event. Complex adaptive system. So although the system is dynamically stable, it has a series of inputs and outputs, and it's dynamically stable, although it never stays exactly the same, right? Because it's always changing. It is subject sometimes to nonlinear effects which hurt the series as a whole. We can think about an ecological collapse scenario, for instance, in that. Okay.
Would Niagara Falls be a good real-world example to understand this thing that is eternally changing yet is stable? Niagara Falls.
Yes, it would. So that this would not necessarily, I mean, you'd have to take a larger view of Niagara Falls to get it into my terms as a complex adaptive system.
I'm just a dumb historian.
However, it does have dynamic stability, which I talked about in one of my series last year, so that the rivers leading up to the falls and the falls are going to be there for millennia, right? But that river and the falls are never exactly the same because they always have different things going
They're
through.
never going to quit.
Not for millennia. So you can't, again, referring this to Bruce, you can't control it, but you can recognize patterns of behavior in it and try to influence them and try to steer those, supposedly. Army ants. So I've got a series of like 4 examples. I don't know if we'll get through them. But you take your average army ant, dumber than mud. You put them on a table, they'll walk around until they die. Okay. But you get 500,000 of them together, they form a complex dynamic adaptive system where they somehow know how to form colonies, protect the leadership, go out and do search strategies for food. They leave pheromones on their way so that when they come back bringing food, other ants go out and follow that to go find the food and bring it back. If you were to look down on the field that they were in, you can see it looks like it was laid out by somebody with an engineering mind. And yet, these dumb army ants were able to come up with a smart system. smell a little something like smoke or something. If anybody who sees anything, let me know. So this can get towards altruism, or what's called multi-level selection. So you might be a dumb army ant, but if you are part of a successful colony, you're going to do okay, right? Because you will have the resources there for multi-level selection. Whereas even if you were an exceptional army ant and your colony was not successful, it wouldn't matter about you individually.
There's a movie about this, it's Leininger and the Ants or the Naked Jungle from 1955.
So with this collective behavior, ants form 25% by weight of all insects alive. So it's adaptive. It's adaptive, and humans have collective behavior, and we're fairly successful too as a species.
There's some collective behavior going on here, David.
Yeah. It sounds a lot worse. It's not coming from the universe.
It's adding complexity to it. We can't trace it.
So an example, the human brain, I've already talked about that a little bit. The immune system, I can talk about that a lot. My conclusion, okay. Reductionism has been a workhorse scientific methodology for centuries, has great success over a period of great progress. But it doesn't really help for complex adaptive systems, and that challenges the universal applicability of the reductionist method as opposed to holism. And complex adaptive systems seem to offer a great example of the somewhat mysterious way complexity advances in the universe. And you know that's one of my bugaboos, is where does this complexity come from? And it appears to be baked in to systems behavior. And as Robbie said, who ordered that? Okay. Systemic behavior, and we see it just in this talk, going up from neurons to the immune system, to gene regulatory networks, to economy, and yet these are all kind of geared where there's a competitive advantage for added complexity, taking the form of these complex adaptive systems. So I think it's a right area for research contra Weinberg. What are your thoughts, questions?
Amen.
Yes?
How does chaos theory fit into this?
Chaos theory would fit into it where you talk about it's very dependent on initial conditions and changes there, so that some of these things, the systems can then generate a so-called great attractor to them and all, so that where it's going is kind of baked into where it started.
I don't know what the great attractor is. I've heard that term before.
Yeah, well, when you talk about chaos theory, if you go back into it, so I'm talking about, does Fibonacci ring a bell?
Yes.
Okay, so that pattern then would be, in my humble opinion, would take the lights of that could be a great attractor towards certain kind of initial conditions over time.
The terms put-up job or baked in have been used here.
Yes.
Would that be kind of similar to the concept of design?
Design. You mean my topic for next week? So that, yeah, I think at a certain level, yes, because then the idea is, if you talk to people in the intelligent design movement and you say, what is the mechanism which leads to this apparent design with irreducible complexity? Did God just come down with a screwdriver and do it? And then they'll usually back off and say, no, we're agnostic on how God does it. We're just saying that we've observed that there seems to be patterning in the universe that is not explicable by normal atheistic means, naturalistic means. So what I'm suggesting is that because complex adaptive systems are kind of ubiquitous and have properties, I'm suggesting that that may be one of the ways in which design can be manifested.
So you're not hesitant to use the word design?
It appears to be designed. And I also mentioned with the army ant that their search pattern appears to be designed and isn't, but it is the result of an ingrained property. and I don't have a real, firm conclusion to come to. Maybe next week.
I think we better close it off here. We're out of time.
Yeah.
But David, thank you so much. Thank you.